So, have you ever wondered if you could actually predict the future just by looking at the past? And I don't mean in some vague, history repeats itself kind of way. I mean with specific patterns, even specific dates. Well, we're going to dive into that today because one professor, Dr. Jiang has put together this incredible and pretty controversial framework that he says can do exactly that.
And get this, his framework points to a massive pileup of global crises, all converging around the year 2026. We're not talking about just one thing going wrong. Nope. He's talking about 3 different layers of conflict all hitting at once. You've got structural conflict at the national level, a systemic level, which he calls an eschatological war. Basically, a hidden ideological battle between elites over the future of humanity. And then, at the individual level, it comes down to the psychology of our leaders. And all of it, he says, is spiraling toward that one point in time.
So you're probably thinking, okay, what kind of patterns could possibly point to something so specific, right? What data, historical, economic, psychological, is he even looking at? Well, that's the big question, and we're about to break his entire model down for you piece by piece.
To even begin to get our heads around this prediction, we've got to start with the core idea behind it all. And trust me, it's a pretty radical way of looking at what global conflict is really about.
According to this framework, all that stuff, the wars, the economic collapses, they're not the actual disease. They're just the symptoms. The real battle, the thing that's actually driving history forward, is happening on a much deeper, psychological level.
And this quote really nails it. What we're seeing as a fight between countries is in reality just a society's internal breakdown playing out for everyone to see. It's a loss of faith, a collapse of belief that's just spilling out onto the world stage.
Okay, so if it's all psychological, then what's the engine driving this whole thing? What's the psychological basis for our global system? To get to that, we have to rewind a bit and look at a huge shift in how people saw the world.
Okay, check out this contrast. The ancient worldview, for the most part, saw consciousness as the source of reality. You know, the idea that there's a divine spark inside all of us. But then, a new idea came along, materialism. The belief that the physical world, that stuff, is all that really matters. And this framework argues that this new idea wasn't just a philosophical shift, it was introduced specifically to justify things like hierarchy and private property. It's like the software update the world needed to run the modern system.
And this belief in materialism is what makes something Dr. Jiang calls power as alchemy possible. Think of it like a giant magic trick that our whole world is built on. It's the art of turning lead, which in this case is our faith in worthless paper money, fiat currency, into gold. And that gold is real-world power, obedience, and naval supremacy. It's basically a mass psychological contract we've all agreed to.
But what happens when that faith breaks? What happens when you have a debt, say a $30 trillion debt, that everyone knows can't possibly be repaid? Well, that's not just a balance sheet problem. That's the moment the magic trick is exposed. The spell breaks, the alchemy fails, and the whole system starts to collapse.
All right, so we've got the big theory down, but how do you actually use this to predict anything? Well, the framework organizes it all into a pretty neat 3-tiered predictive toolkit.
It's a hierarchy of analysis, really. Tier 1 is all about the big foundational models. That's the why. Tier 2 gets into the nitty-gritty mechanisms of control. That's the how. And Tier 3, that's where we get the what-ifs, using actual historical events as blueprints for what might happen next.
So let's zoom in on Tier 2, because this is where things get, well, really controversial. The idea here is that to keep the system running, you need leaders who are, for lack of a better term, psychologically programmed for power. People who've been conditioned to be able to make those really brutal decisions without flinching.
And the framework lays out a 4-step path to how this control is supposedly achieved. Step 1, trauma. You inflict severe stress, physical and psychological. Step 2, dissociation. The mind literally fractures to protect itself from that trauma. Step 3, programming. New identities, new personalities are then installed into those fractured parts of the mind. And finally, Step 4, control. These new identities can be triggered by a handler, sometimes using something as simple as a specific word or sound.
Okay, let's move to Tier 3. This is all about using history as a predictive blueprint. And a perfect example of this is looking at the rivalry between Britain and Germany just before World War I. It's a pattern that, according to this model, can be tracked with a surprisingly simple metric, steel production.
So back in 1893, Germany's steel production overtook Britain's. That was a huge deal. It signaled a massive shift in the balance of power. Now hold that thought. According to this framework, that exact same thing happened again, but this time between the US and China. And the year that critical crossover happened? 2014. That was the year China's economy, when you measure by purchasing power parity, officially became bigger than the US. The historical blueprint was locked in, setting the stage for the same kind of conflict.
So we've got this wild framework, a mix of psychology and history. How does it actually apply to what's happening in the world right now? Well, it pinpoints 3 key geopolitical flashpoints where this whole global drama is playing out.
Let's look at the map. According to the model, Ukraine is basically a controlled demolition of Europe. The goal is to weaken the continent so it can't team up with the rising powers in Eurasia. Then you have Venezuela and South America's lithium triangle. That's all about controlling resources that China desperately needs. And finally, there's Iran. Iran is the linchpin. Creating chaos there is seen as the key to stopping a powerful Russia-China-Iran bloc from ever really getting off the ground.
All right, at this point, it's super important we talk about how to think about all this. I mean, this framework mixes hard data with some pretty wild theories about secret histories. So how do we draw the line between what's a verifiable fact and what's, well, a speculative script?
The framework itself actually gives us a way to do this. It makes a clear distinction between 2 types of analysis. On one side, you have evidence-based projection. This is stuff you can check: economic numbers, troop movements, those steel production ratios we talked about. But on the other side, you have speculative script analysis. This is about interpreting deep historical patterns, myths, even secret histories, like the idea of using ancient Egyptian mythology as a blueprint for programming pharaohs. Totally different categories.
And you know what? Professor Jiang himself is the first one to say this. He literally tells people to be skeptical of the really out there parts of his work, acknowledging that, hey, a lot of the historical records on this stuff have been lost or destroyed. So he's not asking anyone to take this stuff as gospel. It's more about using these ideas as tools to see the world differently, not as proven facts.
And that brings us to our final section. So if some of this is speculative, why should we even care? Why does any of it matter?
Because at the end of the day, the future isn't just decided by who has the biggest army or the strongest economy. It's shaped by the ideas we all choose to believe in, the worldviews we buy into, whether you can prove them or not. Those are the real forces that create our collective reality. They guide what we do, who we trust, and where we all end up.
Which leaves us with one last big question to chew on. If history really is a kind of script, then who's writing it?